Today's daf is daf Chaf Hey, and we'll begin here on daf Chaf Daled Amud Beis, Maskif Lo Rav Papa. Now, before this, we had the Shitos of Abai and Rava, both of whom agree that that part of the mixture where he took the komets from is valid with regard to that part. So you have a mixture of three different Menachos, and he was able to be mafresh from one part. Comes along Rav Papa and he says, no, even on that part where he did the kmitza is invalid. Why? Because Shirayim Didei Nia Nechalim, according to Abai and Rava, and Rav Papa is coming to disagree with them, the Shirayim of that kmitza you're allowed to eat. The Kohanim will eat it because the kmitza was valid. No. Ha'ika danka de kometz de lo karev. Rav Papa's point is that the kmitza is being done for the entire mixture, and 2/3 of that mixture are other people's mincha, and the kometz of one mincha cannot be chal vis-a-vis the other menachos, and therefore the kometz can't even be chal vis-a-vis itself to be matter its own shirayim. And that's pretty much the same question and objection that's going to be raised now by Rav Yitzchak. Maskif lo Rav Yitzchak bereid Rav Mesharshia, the kometz gufe hechi kariv. And now you're telling me that according to Abai and Rava, there's a mutual agreement that the kometz itself, that he did the kmitza, that itself can be brought on the mizbeach. Ha'ika tlasa chulin, right? That's only 1/3 of the picture. You've got another 2/3 that are total chulin because they're invalid. There's no kmitza on them. And Rav Ashi is now going to come along and he's going to reject both Rav Papa and Rav Yitzchak, completely send their objection flying, so to speak, and he's going to say the following: Kometz b'daita de kohen talya milsa. The kohen who does the kmitza, he's going to determine whether that kmitza is related to all the mixture totally, or to only that part. The kohen ki kometz aisaron ko kometz. The kohen, no doubt, has in mind that his kmitza should be on that isaron, not on the other parts, which were mixed together, but they come from other menachos. Now we start today's daf, which is the Mishnah here on Chaf Hey. Now, most of what we're going to be discussing today has to do with the tzitz, right? The tzitz was worn by the Kohen Gadol on his forehead, and it had a special ritzui power. For example, the Mishnah says, Nitma kometz, if the kometz became tamei. Now, we don't bring that which is tamei on the mizbeach, and the kometz requires haktor al gabi mizbeach. But yet the Mishnah says vikrivo, if the Kohen went ahead and he took the kometz, which was contaminated by tumah, and he burnt it on the mizbeach, then hatzitz maratza. There's ritzui tzitz. The word ritzui means a validation of the carbon that generates a ritzui carbon, which means that Hashem accepts the carbon. And the reason why it's accepted, says the Mishnah, is because of the power of the tzitz. And this gives us the principle which is called hatzitz maratz ala tumah. Later on, we'll see whether tumah means specifically that the carbon became tamei, or can we even expand it in a case where the Kohen himself became tamei? That's highly questionable. In any event, yotza. Now we have a case of what's called a psul yotze, in which case the kometz was taken out of the azara, and the Torah says, we'll soon see the pasuk, that when the carbon is taken out of the azara, it's possible. The Kohen went ahead And after the kometz was removed from the Azora, he brought it back into the Azora, v'krivo, and he burnt it on the Mizbeach. Ein hatzitz maratz. Tzitz is maratz on Tuma, but not on a psul of Yotze. Shatzitz maratz al Tuma, ve'enu maratz al Yotze. So the Gemara is going to now bring down the Brisa. Tana Rabbanan. The pasuk which teaches me about the Ritzi Tzitz, the power of the Tzitz, is V'nasa Aaron es Avon HaKadoshim. So there's a certain Avera that was done, and we're going to see that the Brisa is going to interpret that Avera as the Kohen who brought a carbon that was Nitma, that became Tomei on the Mizbeach, and V'nasa Aaron. V'nasa Aaron means that Aaron is carrying the tzitz on his forehead, and that tzitz will generate a ritzu, invalidate a carbon which was not really permitted to be brought, namely v'chiyeza avon unose im tomar. And now the Gemara is going to offer a number of possibilities, because the Torah was particularly vague here, and it didn't define the avon on which the tzitz is maratza. What is that avon? Now, if we have a number of possible candidates for what the Torah had in mind by avon, then we're going to look for kulos in each case. And if there's a kula, then it's more logical to assume that the avon that the Torah had in mind was X because it has that kula. So, for example, in Tomer Avon Pigul, if you want to say that the Kohen had in mind at the time of one of the four avodos that the carbon should be eaten by the Kohanim, or the Avarim of the carbon should be burnt on the Mizbeach, li'achar zmano, after its time allotted time, then it becomes pigul. And we discussed many times that chutz zmano generates pigul, and if anyone eats that basar, he's chayiv kares. So maybe we would say that if an event that the Kohen had in mind, chutz zmano, during any of the four avodos, now if the carbon is brought, it's maratza. Why? Because the tzitz has the power of ritzui. So Gemara said, the Brisa says that's impossible. Why? Harei kvar nemar lo yechoshev. Now this pasuk lo yechoshev, which he tells you here, is in Vayikra Zion, in Parshas Tzav. It's a very long pasuk. Right, the whole parsha of Pigul is in the parsha of Shlomim. Lo yirotze. Okay, and this is the parsha of Pigul Yad Nefesh, etc. So there's a mistake in the printing that Rashi points out. In the printed text of Agamor, it says Lo Yichashev. We'll soon see that Lo Yichashev is actually a pasuk for Chutz L'Mkomo. And the pasuk for Chutz L'Zmano, which mistakenly got pushed off to Chutz L'Mkomo, is really the pasuk here that says Lo Yirotze. So when you see these words Lo Yichashev, just cross them out and instead write Lo Yirotze. The im tomer avon nosar, right? Just 1 second. Lo yichashev, he says here, is in Perek Zayin. I don't get it here. I think there's a mistake in the printing here, Mike Moore. He says that Lo Yichashev is in Perek Zayin. I wish I had the time now to start opening up the Chumash. If you don't mind doing that, Steve, open up a Chumash Vayikra to Perek Zayin Pasuk Yud Ches and see if it says Lo Yichoshev. I don't. Just one second. Oh, Lo Yichoshev. Oh, I found it. One second. Lo Yichoshev. Right, it does say Lo Yichoshev. Oh, I'll tell you what it is. The word pigul here in this brisa is not really referring to pigul, meaning we're talking about chutzum komo. And chutzum komo is not really pigul. I mean, sometimes we use the word pigul in a generic sense to include even chutzum komo. In the case of chutzum komo, that machshava passes the carbon, but it doesn't make it into pigul. So the truth is that when it says here im tomar avon pigul, then it's really referring to chutz lim komo, using the borrowed term pigul. And how do I know this? Because afterwards it says im tomar avon nosar, and that's chutz zmano. That's real pigul. But look for nemar lo yirotze. And here it should say lo yichoshev, not lo yirotze, because the real pigul, which is Vayikra Zayin Pasuk Yud Ches, says lo yirotze. Let me just see. Lo yirotze. The truth is, it says both lo yirotze and lo yichoshev. So we could perhaps get away with it. That's going to be Rabbeinu Tam. All right. In any event, we've excluded these cases of machshavas chutzum zman and chutzum komo as far as Ritzi Tzitz is concerned, because the Torah goes out of its way to say in an absolute fashion, lo yechashev, lo yerotze. So what are we left with? We're left with ha'eno nose el avon tumah. We're only left with tumah. Now, why would tumah be less chamor than pigul? And the answer is shehutra mechlolo b'tzibur, because if you have a carbon tzibur, then the Torah was matir bringing the carbon b'tumah. So that's a kula. Now the Gemara says maskif lo Rav Zera raises a kasha ema avon yotze. Maybe the power of the tzitz is to be maratza on a carbon that was taken out of the azara, which is pasul midin yotze. And we're going to try to now demonstrate, says Rav Zera, that there's a kula in the psul of yotze. And what is that? Shehuter mechlolo bebama. So we know about a bama. We've already discussed this. We'll go over it again. That during certain periods of Jewish history, you were allowed to set up a bama and bring a carbon on your own bama. For example, after the destruction of Mishkan Shiloh, there were a kind of a Mishkan that was set up in Novi Givon, and that Mishkan has what's called a Bama Gedola and a Bama Ketana. The Bama Gedola would be for Karbanos Tzibur in Novi Givon. And then there's something called a Bama Ketana when I set up my own personal altar in my backyard, and I bring my own private Karbanos on that altar. And in the case of a Bama, there's no Psul Yotze. Now Rashi explains why is there no Psul Yotze in a Bama? Because there are no kloim, there are no mechitzos or curtains. Like for example, in the Mishkan in the Midbar there were kloim, and therefore there's a Psul Yotze if you take it out of the kloim. And in Shiloh, likewise, there were kloim. So the star of the show today is the Tosas Yontif. Tosas Yontif has a whole analysis here of Rashi, and Rashi's going to give us the impression that there were no kloim in Nova Givon, which would imply that even for a carbon tzibur in the Bama Gedola of Nova Givon, there would be no psul of Yotze. That's not true. As the Tosas Yontif points out, he lived, I think, about 400 years ago. he points out that based on different sugyas, that in a Bama Gedola, there were actually kloim. There were curtains, and therefore there would be a psul of yotze. And when it says here that hutra michlola bibama, it's referring to the bamas yachid. Bamas yachid obviously has no kloim. I just put up an altar in my backyard. There are no curtains, there are no mechitzas, nothing, and therefore there's no yotze. So again, just to summarize, Rashi is going to learn here that's referring to no v'gimon, even the Bama Gdola. And the Tosiyontiv is going to point out that in a Bama Gdola, even though it's B'shas Heter Bamos, there is a Psul Yotze because there are Kloim. And if the Bryce is insisting that Hutra Mechlola Eitzel Bama, it's talking about a Bama of a Yochid, a Bama Ketana. Amalei Abaye, Amar Kra. Abai says, I have an answer to Abzera's objection. The Torah says, L'rotzon lahem lifnei Hashem. Right, with regard to tzitz, the pasuk that we started with, it says lifnei Hashem, meaning he brought the carbon, but he brought it bituma. And that's an avon lifnei Hashem. He shouldn't have brought the carbon, but it's lifnei Hashem. Avon de lifnei Hashem, avon de yotze lo. But the sin of Yotze is outside the Azor, so it can't be Lifnei Hashem. And that's going to answer Abzera's objection and prove that there's no power of the tzitz to be maratza on the Psul Yotze. Maskif le Rav Eloi, Ema, Avon, small. What happens if the Kohen did the Avoda, not with his right hand, but with his left hand, and the carbon is possible? Now maybe that avera of going ahead and doing the carbon with the avoda with your left hand is now subject to the ritzui of tzitz. And I'll show you how the ritzui of tzitz is a great, that this case of small is a very good candidate because, again, it's lo eb, meaning that there's a huter mechlolo. Shahuter mechlolo b'yom HaKippurim, when the Kohen Gadol goes into the Kodesh Kadoshim. For the avodas haktores, the Torah says he has to take the machta, which has the coals in it, and the ktores, the machta in his right hand, the ktores in his left hand, and then he pours the ktores from the ladles, from the spoons, into the coals that he's holding with his right hand. The pouring of the ktores is also considered an avoda, and therefore requires yad yamin. And yet the Torah says he could use small. So we see that within the constellation of the psul karbon biad small, there is a hutar mechlal, and that's the case Yom Kippurim. Amalei Abai says that's not a proof. The Torah is talking about in ritzui tzitz. Right? The Torah is talking about V'nosar Aaron es avon hakadoshim. When the Kohen Gadol takes the ladle in his left hand, that's not an avon kadoshim. Adarabah. Avon shahayabod chiyosov. In the case of Tumah, for example, in a carbon tzibur, the Torah was dolcha that avera. But in the case of Lafuki Yom HaKippurim dechshero b'smolu, the Torah says this is the way you have to do the avodah. There's no avon over here. There's no what we call here in Israel. It's an Arabic word fashla. There's no fashla here. He didn't mess up in any way. Now Rav Ashi also wants to offer an answer to Rav Hila's kash, and he says Rashi Omar avona kadosh v'lo avona makdishin. The power of the tzitz is to bring ritzui if there was an avera on the carbon itself, meaning the carbon was tameh. Or like we said before, what if it's yotze? What else did we have here? Just 1 second. Do we have another one before we got to small? Just 1 second. Oh, right, or Pigul and Nosar. Where else are the carbon is possible? So all the candidates that we suggested for Ritzui Tzitz were all what you call in Rav Ashi's language Avona Kadoshim. But you're asking a question now, Rav Eloi, about Yad Small. That's in the Avon of the Makdishim. meaning the Kohen who did the avoda and he improperly did the avoda, that's already beyond the scope of the tzitz. Amalei Rav Sima Breder Rav Idi Rav Ashi V'em avon balmum. Oh, so I think that we have to be very careful here about balmum. Right? There's two categories of balmum. There's the balmum of the animal itself, of the korban, which is called Avona Kadoshim, and then there's a Balmum of the Kohen, the Makdishim, who does the Avodah, and he's a Balmum, which also passes the Karban. That's not what we're referring to, not the latter. We're referring to the former. In other words, when the Gemara raises the problem about maybe the tzitz is Maratz and Avon Balmum, it's talking about the animal became a Balmum, and what's the kula that we find that makes this a very attractive candidate? Shahuta Mechlol Biofos. The Omar Tamus v'zachrus behema v'ain tamus v'zachrus biofos. Right, tamus is a reference to a perfect animal without any blemish. Zachrus has to do with korbanos that have to be brought from a male animal, and that distinction between male and female only applies to animals, not to ophos. Nor does the principle of tamus, which means that the animal that's being brought in the mizbech doesn't have any blemish, that also has no application to birds, because in the case of birds, there's no difference between a bird that's a balmum and a bird that's not a balmum. So now we're stuck with the question: maybe the tzitzis maratza in the case of an animal balmum that was brought on the mizbeach, and he had no right to be makriv that animal, but once he did so, the tzitzis maratza, and the balmum is subject to a huta mechlolo, a leniency, insofar as the birds don't have a psul of balmum. This is why the Torah emphasizes, with regard to balimum, lo yirotze, ki lo lerotzon yelachem. So the Torah completely excludes, in an absolute way, any acceptance of the korban of a balmum, and therefore tzitz cannot be maratza. Tana Rabbanan, dam shenitma uzroko. Okay, what happened over here? The dam became tame. Now, once the dam is tame, you can't use it for a hakrava and aktor al gabi mizbeh, but he went ahead and he did so. Uzroko. Now, the Brisa continues by raising the following question: did he do so deliberately? No, he mamish knew that the dam had contracted tumah, and nevertheless, flagrantly, he went ahead. Now, let's not go too far here. Even if the Kohen did this deliberately, at the end of the day, he's not a lahachisnik. He wants to achieve ritzi korban. Maybe he knew very well that the dam was tummy. He knew very well that you're not allowed to be. But in his gusto, in his excitement about bringing the korban, he went ahead and he was zorik the dam. And here we're going to have a machlokas. According to the first opinion, b'shogig hurtza b'mezid lo hurtza. If the Kohen deliberately and knowingly went ahead and he was zorek the dam that was nitma, that became tameh, then we're going to have to disqualify the korban. And that's going to be what's called a knas, a penalty for flagrantly or deliberately violating these. Again, even though he may have been motivated by the right things, but this is called mezid. And mezid, they made a knas. Bamedvar mamurim biyachid. Aval betzibur bein b'shogig bein b'mezid hurtza. In a case of a korban tzibur, we see that the Torah is more lenient and tries to push forward the korban and be machshir, like we saw about Tumah. Here, in our context, and we're talking now about the dam shenitma, and it's a korban tzibur, we're going to validate the carbon. There's no one to penalize here because no one has any vested interest. It's a carbon that belongs to the entire community of Israel and will be machshir. But Oved Kol Chavim, now a guy, the Gemara learns from Sukkim, is allowed to bring certain karbanos, basically an ola, and now the carbon of a guy was sacrificed despite the fact that the dam was tame, is a bein b'shogeg bein meisa bein meros bein meratzon lo hurtza. Like the first two words on the next page. So with regard to the carbon of a guy, there's an absolute disqualification of dam shenitma. The carbon is possible even if the Kohen who did the avodah was unaware of the fact that the dam was tamei. He found out later on. That's called shogeg, and nevertheless, in the case of an akum, possible. So again, let's just go over the brisa 3 paragraphs. In the case of a carbon yachid, it depends whether he did it b'mezid or b'shogeg. However, what that means is that in the case of a mezid, knowing full well that it was tamei, he went ahead and he zorik the dam of a carbon yachid, the carbon is possible. And that's the penalty, the knas, for knowingly violate the Isur Tumah. However, we get to the second paragraph, and that's a carbon tzibur. Here we go to the extreme, and we say that no matter what, even if the Kohen had in mind knowingly that it was tamei, doesn't matter. Carbon tzibur is docha tumah. Then we have the third case, which is the extreme on the other side, that even in the case of shogeg or onos, in the case of a carbon of a guy, the carbon is absolutely possible.